You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.
Hello there and welcome to News Talks, the Times Higher Education podcast in which we discuss the biggest stories in global higher ed. I'm Miranda Prynne, campus editor, and today I'm joined by our rankings editor, Naomi Firsht, as the latest Times Higher Education Sustainability Impact Ratings are unveiled, revealing which universities are leading the pack in working towards the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. So it's been a very busy couple of weeks for you leading up to this launch, Naomi. How are you feeling now that you have finally reached results day?
It's exciting. It's always good to get to the launch and be able to tell everyone, well, the results of our rankings and to be able to reveal our data analysis. And we take in so much data for these rankings. So it's nice to finally be able to present it all and draw out all the interesting stories.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, this is the 8th year of these unique rankings, which assess universities' progress against each of the 17 SDGs, which, as most listeners will know, seek to address the major global challenges of our time. So, for instance, SDG 1, ending poverty, SDG 4, quality education for all, and of course, SDG 13, combating climate change, to name a few. But I guess in broader terms, what this represents is how universities can and are making a really positive impact and helping to build a viable, more just future for our species and our planet. A key component, of course, of the social license of higher education. So thousands of universities around the world put in submissions for these rankings each year, keen to showcase and demonstrate some of their most impactful work. Let's start by looking at this year's results, Naomi. In 2026, who is up and who is down, and who perhaps is always strong in this space?
So we do have a new number one this year for our overall ranking. So that's quite exciting. So for our overall ranking, the number one is the University of Manchester in the UK. So this isn't necessarily a big surprise because they were number two last year. So we know they're a strong performer. Manchester is a consistently strong performer for us in these rankings. They are the only university that has been in the overall top 10 in every year of the rankings. And as you said, this is our 8th edition of the Sustainability Impact Ratings. Perhaps worth just mentioning as well, we've had a name change. So they are the Sustainability Impact Ratings. They were formerly the Impact Rankings. So please don't be confused. It's the same. Okay, so Manchester is number one, which also they are sort of leading a very strong performance, I would say, from the UK in general. Manchester itself also leads on some of our individual SDG tables, either in first place outright or joint first place. And I believe that's in 5 tables. They've got first place. And then, so them jumping to number one has meant the end of a 4-year run in number one for Western Sydney University in Australia, which was, again, it's very impressive to have a 4-year run. And they're still very high up. So they're number 3 this year. So they've slipped down a little, but still an excellent result from them too. Our number 2 is another Australian university, Griffith University. Now, I think quite interestingly, we've actually got 5 Asian universities in the top 10 this year. 2 from Malaysia, 1 from South Korea, 1 from Taiwan, and 1 from Japan. So that is quite a big change on last year when we had 2 from Asia in the top 10 last year. And that is a bit of a trend that we're seeing as well with Asia performing well in our rankings on sustainability.
And are there any surprises this year in terms of the results?
I would say no big surprises, but some impressive progress, especially when, for example, if you look at representation, we're seeing very high representation from East and Southeast Asia. The Philippines is our most strongly represented country. They've got 160 universities in the overall ranking. And we've also got strong representation from other nations in that region, Thailand, for example, as well, and Malaysia doing very well, as I mentioned before. So I think no big shocks, but some interesting progress.
Yeah. And for someone less familiar with these rankings or ratings, as they're now known, can you explain in simple terms how a university is judged against each SDG? As I know it's a little more complicated than simply looking at, for instance, their research impact or their teaching focus. So, what are the criteria for this?
It's true, this is a bit of a complicated one in terms of our methodology because instead of just the one table, we have 18 because what we do is we measure universities against all 17 of the SDGs. So we have 17 tables, each one relating to an individual SDG, and then one overall ranking. And the way that we give a score for our overall ranking is we ask universities to submit data for SDG 17, which is partnerships for the goals. That's the only one that's obligatory, and at least three other SDGs. So they can choose, they could submit for all of them if they wanted, just, three or four. It's up to them. And then what our data scientists do is they take the best three results of the individual SDGs plus the result for SDG 17, and they make a calculation based on that to come up with our overall score. The overall score in the overall ranking is also based on an average of this year's plus last year's. So it's a little bit complicated, but hopefully that more or less explains how we have the different tables. Then within each individual SDG, so you were asking how do we assess universities for each SDG? It's a combination of things. So it actually does vary for each SDG because they are quite different. As you were outlining before, you have no poverty, you've got climate change, we've got clean water and sanitation. There's all these different things, so it can be difficult. But essentially, we're looking at research and we're looking at continuous metrics, like, for example, how many graduates from that university did a health-related degree. And we're looking at concrete policies and initiatives from the university. So one example might be when we're looking at, I think I mentioned the clean water SDG. How does that university deal with wastewater in their university? And they'll get, they'll show what their policy is, they'll give evidence for how well it's working, and there'll be a score based on that as an example. So that's why each SDG does vary a bit because we're looking at such different goals.
Of course, it's not comparing like for like if you take these 17 different
No.
goals. But from what you describe, it actually really tries to take a broad view of the very diverse work that goes on within universities. And ultimately, it is about which institutions are making the greatest positive difference in the arena of that particular sustainable development goal. Are there any particular countries or regions where the SDGs and sustainability appears to be taken particularly seriously?
Yes. Again, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, the ASEAN region, that's the region I mentioned before, which shows very high representation in these tables. They do seem to be prioritizing SDGs. And we have a really good article on this by our reporter, John Ross, and where he spoke to people in the region about why does it seem to be a priority for them? And what was coming out was that, things like climate change, like rapid urbanization, these are challenges that those countries, it's not an abstract concept for them. They're dealing with them on a day-to-day basis, and they have to come up with solutions, often low cost solutions, sort of high impact, low cost. And those are challenges they have to deal with. And that's one of the reasons that the SDGs make sense for them, to be a priority within higher education.
Yeah, it's a living or lived reality.
Exactly.
And they're often at the coalface of some of the environmental damage, for instance, that is being done. Do you notice certain places then focusing on certain goals?
Well, we did try and analyze this a bit, but the way that we looked at it was this year we had some new data on the income level of different countries. So we were looking at are lower income countries managing to perform better, and they're managing to start sort of narrowing the gap with their wealthier competitors who, as you would expect, do tend to perform well in rankings. So, for example, when we looked at lower income countries, they were performing strongest in SDGs 1, which is no poverty, 3, good health and well-being, and 17, partnerships for the goals. I mean, you can see it in our main analysis online. There's a little bit more about how that compares to how the ones that higher income countries will focus on and do better in.
Yeah, interesting. Speaking of higher income countries, this is an area where the UK, whose higher education system at the moment feels fairly undervalued, depending on what particular perspective you're looking at it from. But this is an area where the UK appears to excel. Why do you think that is?
Well, the UK does have a strong performance. Not every UK university in the rankings. Some did slip down, but I do think overall it's fair to say the UK does a good performance. I mean, if you take Manchester, I think the UK performs well in areas that sort of make sense. So one example for Manchester is it comes first in SDG 11, which is sustainable cities. Obviously, Manchester is one of the biggest cities in the UK, and also the Manchester University itself runs 4 cultural institutions, which includes museums, includes art galleries. So it makes sense. There's places where, well, they are well placed to do well. And I mean, a university like Manchester, they have made a point of making a commitment to integrate SDGs into everything, into their ethos, into their curriculum. So it's hard to say there's one general theme for the UK, but I think it's sort of there's areas that make sense, and that's where the UK tends to do well.
I mean, generally, the top of these ratings are still largely dominated by institutions from wealthier nations, or the world's wealthiest nations. One notable example of a country that sits outside of the wealthiest nations, although it's also not among the poorest, but is very well represented, is, as you've already said, Malaysia. I wondered if we knew what lay behind Malaysia's success in driving sustainability across its institutions.
Yes, so we did look a bit into this as well. So Malaysia does make a point of putting investment into this area. It does focus on SDGs and aligning with them. And I think there was also, from what we were seeing, the state as well as invested in that's not just higher education. So they get support, they get the funding, and obviously that has an impact. And they were already, starting to do quite well last year, and they've built on that this year. And I think especially having 2 universities in the top 10 is a real achievement. And Malaysia, it's not a lower income country, but it's known as upper middle income. So it is still very impressive, especially to have 2 universities in the top 10. And I don't believe they were in the top 10 at all last year. I think the 2 Asian countries were Indonesia and South Korea. But I mean, even if we want to talk about lower income countries, we certainly did draw out in our analysis that there has been a narrowing of the gap between lower income countries and wealthier nations. So, for example, we have this year 4 lower middle income institutions in our top 50. That's double the number from last year. And the high income countries in the top 50 have actually gone down. So they've gone down to 34 from 39. So even though we're looking at small amounts, it is still quite interesting to see the movement. And this came out as well in average scores for countries. So in terms of the high income countries, the average score was down by 2 points, whereas the low-income countries where we have data for them for this year and last year, their average score actually went up. It went up from 45.5 to 49.5. So that's actually quite a decent jump up. So we are seeing some movement, and I think, perhaps that is an indication of where countries are prioritizing this kind of work, and also where these kinds of rankings are perhaps a little bit more accessible for maybe a wider range of universities than, it is different to our flagship world university rankings, where we are really looking at academic excellence, and the criteria for research is very high, and not every country can do that with all of their universities.
Yes, this is looking at impact that goes far beyond what is necessarily often driven by, let's face it, very, very large funding and financial backing. You referenced that Malaysia, of course, that part of their progress has been driven by a real deliberate focus on driving sustainability and other SDGs, I should say, and the fact that that very much comes from government as well as the institutions. There is a bigger question here about how much do a country's universities represent that country's priorities as a whole? And I'm interested in your thoughts on this. How far do you think this is representative of just those nations really starting to take this very seriously and try and drive action on it?
I think there is probably an element of truth in that. And it goes to the point that we mentioned before, where a lot of these countries are dealing with some of these challenges now. These are real-time problems for them, whereas there's a lot of challenges here that feel a lot more abstract for us in Western, wealthier countries. So I think there is probably an element of truth in that. And yeah, and you can see where countries are investing. And I think as we go forward, we'll see if that holds, if it's true, if countries continue to prioritize SDGs, sustainability, and if that results in better performance from their universities in our ratings.
Yeah, and I mean it's well documented that a lot of these lower income nations are disproportionately suffering the impact of climate change and all the many complications that brings, whether it be migration, lack of food, all the sort of knock-on effects of that. And the fact that, as you say, for wealthier nations, while we are affected, I mean, as we speak, we are in London undergoing an all too increasingly regular, I have to say, heat wave. But ultimately, a heat wave for us is nothing compared to some of the impacts felt in other places in the world. I mean, the last 12 months have actually been fairly tumultuous in every sense in terms of world events. And can we draw any links between these geopolitical events and kind of macro global trends and these ratings?
I think it would be difficult to really draw a direct line and see if any kind of geopolitical event, be it conflict or natural disaster or anything, could really show up in our results, because also you have to allow for the fact that there's a little bit of a gap between us taking in the data and producing the results. I do think it's interesting to see how different countries who are perhaps in conflict zones or undergoing these kinds of challenges, how they deal with sustainability. So, for example, from Ukraine. So Ukraine is obviously now into its 5th year of conflict. However, Ukraine actually performs pretty well in this year's ratings, and I think they did last year as well. They have a good amount of representation. I believe they're the second most represented country in Europe. And so we had a blog from the Deputy Minister of Education in Ukraine about why it seems to still be a priority for them when, you're essentially in a war zone. And, we got some really interesting insights, especially because this deputy minister also was previously a leader of one of the universities in Ukraine. So, he knows a lot about the higher education sector. And, he was talking about how it's still important. It just takes on a slightly different meaning. One of the SDGs, number 4, is quality education. And that means different things for different countries. For Ukraine, he was saying it means, can students access education, even physically? Because we know that some universities were completely displaced since the beginning of the war. So it's interesting to see how sustainability can still be important, but just takes on a new meaning.
Yeah, and I take your point that things that happen in the last 12 months are unlikely to have an immediate impact because you've got to look at longer term data than that. And of course, we all know that work that goes on within a university is, can take time before the results of it actually start to be felt or seen. But we do, of course, now have 8 years of data on this. And I wondered if there were any trends we could observe over the slightly longer term in terms of university efforts on the SDGs.
I think for me the most striking trend is still the Asia trend, Asia as a whole, and then looking a bit more specifically at East and Southeast Asia. They're making progress in these areas. It's obviously become a priority for them. So I think that's probably the most striking one that stands out for me.
And of course, that region and a lot of those countries are also investing heavily in their higher education systems and seeing improved performance among their universities across the board. I wondered how strongly tied you felt these ratings were to wider university performance. I mean, when a country or institution is doing well, is this indicative of a wider quality boost?
I think when a university does well in any area, then it is usually a sign that they're investing in the university and in higher education. These kinds of rankings are, I would say, quite different, as I said before, to something like the World University Rankings. So they're measuring very different things, and as a result, these particular rankings, the sustainability rankings, tend to be a little bit more volatile. So it's hard to say for sure, but I mean, when universities putting money into any areas, really, hopefully we're looking at a quality boost. And I think I would say one of the things about our methodology that I particularly like is that we are asking for specific evidence, and not just in terms of do you have a policy on X, Y, or Z, but what have you implemented? Has it been successful? And that's why you get these nice examples of where universities are doing well, particularly in their outreach and working with communities, because that's a lot of that is to do with the SDGs. So Western Sydney that I mentioned before, the university that did LEAD 4 years in a row. So one of the examples they gave us was that they have this project in India where what they do is they sort of combine local knowledge of water in the area with a phone app, so with a smartphone app. And by combining that, they can help optimize crop growing in the area. And it's just a really nice example of university knowledge and outreach combining with a local community knowledge and doing something really helpful. And I think that what's nice about these ratings is we can draw out these examples of having an impact.
Yeah, of course, but having an impact in a very real world sense, felt by people well outside of the higher education sphere, which is so vital, but often quite hard to quantify, and therefore sometimes a bit overlooked when it comes to kind of judging how well a university is doing. How much of a bearing on students' choice of where to study do we think a university's credentials in sustainability and the SDGs has these days?
There have been some polls done on this, and it is increasingly important to students, which I think is what you'd expect, really. The younger generations tend to be much more interested in sustainability and looking at what things they can do to reduce their carbon footprint, all that kind of thing. And they want to know that their institutions that they might be attending are doing the same thing. So it is starting to matter, and there are polls that show that. And I think that's probably not a surprise to most of us.
So, taking a step back, is progress towards the 17 goals accelerating or slowing down, would you say, across global HE?
It's hard to say whether it's accelerating or slowing down. I would say the ratings show that the SDGs and working towards sustainability overall is something that is becoming increasingly important to universities globally. I think it's difficult to say for sure is progress accelerating because we don't necessarily have the exact same universities in our ratings this year as that were in last year. So, just in terms of comparison, you can't know for sure. But I think there's encouraging information coming out that this is becoming a priority, that there are some really innovative projects going on in the higher education sector working towards SDGs. And we'll see next year if they build on that.
Yes, and arguably the sheer number of universities who are keen to be involved in these ratings in itself speaks volumes, because it shows that thousands of institutions all over the world see this as being incredibly important and something that they do actually want to really shout about. And yes, as you say, there are some amazing initiatives going on. So I would say that this year's sustainability impact ratings should give us all some hope that we can answer the most pressing challenges that humanity faces, but the battle is far from won. I say that speaking from a desperately sweaty London right now. Naomi, thank you so much for demystifying the 2026 sustainability impact ratings for us.
It's a pleasure.
And that's it for this week. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please do like, share, or subscribe. There are many more episodes of News Talks covering everything from whether China's Greater Bay Area could become the world's next leading higher education hub, to the fallout from the University of Sussex's victory over the OFS in relation to protecting free speech. And you can find all that at timeshighereducation.com/podcasts. We will be back with you in a couple of weeks. Thank you. Bye-bye.
You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.